Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we begin the study of what I call utilities, or the essential services that without which man and society cannot exist. And I'm going to begin the story back in Spanish time, the last Spanish period here, early in the 19th century, and what Pensacola was like then. We're showing a map on the screen right now. Actually, the map was done just a few years beyond the time that I'm actually talking about, but the substance is the same, because I wanted to illustrate for you where our water supply for Pensacola was back in those days. The map shows that there was a large spring to the west of the city, about opposite where Wright Street would intersect today. That was the principal water supply. There was a second spring at the about where Palafox and Garden would intersect today, and a third large spring at the head of Bayou Chico, although that was rather infrequently used. Now, bear in mind, at this point in time, water and sewer services were basically a personal affair. There were no organized companies. No, the government itself did nothing about these services except, as you will see in just a moment, except to begin to supervise and require sanitation at a basic level. But during the Spanish period, there's very little we can say. People had wells, most of them did. Many used the springs. And one thing we can say that they did add, the Spanish government did add, early in the 19th century, they bought a fire engine that was manufactured in Spain, delivered here. And of course they did this because fires were frequent then, just as they might be today. And at that time the Spanish began the same sort of technique that later fire departments would use here. That is, they placed large barrels of water up and down the major streets, and if a fire began, the fire engine would race up there, pulled by the men involved, of course. They would put one end of their hose in the fire bucket, they would put the other end of the hose toward the fire, pump away, and hopefully that would do some good. And incidentally, that fire engine must have been a very good one, because it was still in use in Pensacola after the Civil War. Well, now we come through the early part of the last Spanish period into the American period, and things changed very little. The American city of Pensacola grew very slightly from about 700 people in the year 1821 to close to 1,000, 1,100 people as we move into the early 1830s. And by the time we get to 1836, one can see that the city council, the aldermen of Pensacola, were becoming concerned about public safety. And I want to read you just three little items here that appeared in 1836 from new ordinances that this council passed. Now, bear in mind that the city council began its work in 1821 with just 8 ordinances. None of them dealt with public safety. By the time we get to 1836, a lot of things had changed, and so the council sat down, and in a rather unusual period, they passed 43 additional ordinances, some of which did deal with public safety. And I want to read just a couple of them, because they illustrate for you how people were looking at things then. This was ordinance number 3, passed in 1836. It said, "Be it ordained that it shall be the duty of the city marshal or his assistants, on or before the first day of May in each year, to give notice to each and every housekeeper in the city that the kitchens, privies, outhouses, and premises of such housekeeper shall be kept clean, and from the said day of May until the first day of October, under a penalty of $5 if the inspector found them wanting." Okay, that was one. We move forward then to ordinance number 18, which said this. This will give you an idea now of how some of the water supply was being handled from the springs. It says, "Be it ordained that any person who shall roll a water barrel on the sidewalk or pavement of the street shall be fined the sum of $1, and if the offense be committed by a slave and the fine shall not be paid, he or she shall receive whipping with 10 stripes. It gives you an idea of how things were back in 1836. Then one final one. This is ordinance number 24 of the year 1836. It said, "Be it ordained that any person who shall injure or do damage to the public springs shall be fined in any sum not to exceed $20, and if the offender be a slave and the fine not paid, he or she shall receive not exceeding 25 stripes of the whip." So you can see that the city council was very concerned about the public springs, because the fine of $25 was in those days a very substantial sum. Okay, we moved through the period of the early American period, and the only time we really refer again to utilities came during the Mexican War. And it was at this time that the United States Navy needed to provision and prepare its ships for duty off the Mexican coast, and these several warships were sent to Pensacola, and they had two requirements here beyond conditioning the bottoms of the ships. One was to provide ship's biscuit for 6 months, and the other water supply for 6 months. Well, these ships arrived, and the poor commandant at the Navy was nonplussed at this, because as he quickly told the captain aboard the vessel, we get all of our rain by collecting it in cisterns. It's rainwater. We don't have a supply here. But at that point in time, a number of the city fathers recognized the need, and they sent the two men who were by profession well drillers, and they rushed out to the Navy and applied their skills, built new wells, and consequently, during the need for supplying the ships, that work was done, and the Navy got a credit for it. A little bit later on, of course, the folks in Washington were very red-faced, recognizing that they had done such a poor job over a quarter of a century of preparing their Navy Yard here. Well, we move forward into the war period and beyond, and we come to the early part of the 1880s. By now, Pensacola, of course, has benefited from the beginning of the lumbering industry. We have our railroad in place. We have our fishing industry started, and the population is growing. By the time we get to 1882-83, the city has 12,000 people. Now, at that point, please remember that the same utility methods were in place that were there back in the Spanish period, the British period, the early American period. We had no water system. We had no sewage system. Every home or business had its well. The public springs were still in use. There was no sewage system. So basically, by the time we get to 1882 or 83, well, the city was beginning to have some serious problems. And number one of this, among these, of course, was fire. Because most of our buildings were built of wood, and downtown the buildings were built very close together. As going down Palafox Street today, one would see the same kind of immediate configuration there. And so, rather jokingly, the several newspapers that were being printed then began to talk about the fire of the week, which was this was not intended to be a pleasant chide, of course. And of course, the city fathers became very concerned, but the city itself took no action. It was a group of private citizens led by a man named Benjamin Pitt, who was in the building materials business and had what became known as Pitt Slip down along the waterfront. Mr. Pitt headed a private company. They sold bonds, and they went into the water business, laying mains up and down the streets with a pumping station on the waterfront. And on what was still being called Gage's Hill, and at our Lee Square, they put the standpipe, which of course was the pressure device for the system. Now remember, they built this system primarily to have a system of fire hydrants. But of course, as soon as water was there, residents and commercial businesses said, well, we want access to that water too. And so over the next year or two, the water system for in-house use began to evolve. And almost at the same time, a gentleman by the name of Wiki arrived in town and opened what we would today call a plumbing fixtures business. So first of all, you had water, and then you had a fixtures business. And of course, if water goes into a building, some of it has to come out. And so almost immediately, beginning early in 1885, the city council voted funds and began to put in our first elements of a sewage system. And of course, this involved pipes up and down the streets connected into the residence. And all of the sewage was collected into larger mains and was piped directly south, and it went right into the bay untreated. And of course, at this point in time, nobody worried too much about environmental concerns. And that's basically the way things would remain, as our story will tell you a little bit later. That's the way sewage treatment was handled up until the 1930s. Well, as we have the sewage system, we have the water system, things are in place, and almost by magic, I guess, or certainly by good fortune, inventions and science were providing new tools. And while we talk of utilities, and we're thinking primarily of water and sewage, other things began to fall into place at this same time. In the same year, 1885, Pensacola got its first elements of the telephone system. This was the Florida telephone company. The little station with 250 subscribers was down on Government Street, and we were the second telephone service or system in all of the state of Florida. That was in place, of course, and it grew gradually. The only problem that began to emerge for the local council and others was where and how many telephone poles could be put up, because as soon as these large poles were erected along main streets, a lot of the people began to complain. We moved forward just a couple of years to 1887, and in that year, the Pensacola Electric Company took form. Now, of course, electricity had been harnessed by Mr. Edison just 7 years before up in New York State. And now the first electric system comes into play here. Basically, it was started primarily to serve the streetcars. But just as with the water and sewage system, once it was in place, people in homes and businesses wanted it, and the system evolved. The Pensacola Electric Company had a generating plant at the foot of Balin Street, and they moved forward to the north. And I don't want to give the impression that everyone was suddenly electrified within the city, and certainly not within the county. This took place very slowly. The streetcars did receive the service by 1892, and we moved forward very nicely with all this. But of course, to take care of all of this, you had a number of people coming in as professionals. Now you had more plumbers, you had more steam fitters, and people like that who could take care of this kind of system. Now, in almost exactly the same year, 1884-85, Pensacola got its first big element of culture, and that was the opening of the Pensacola Opera House. The Opera House was a magic thing for downtown Pensacola. It provided all sorts of entertainment several nights a week, and of course it had a couple of problems. Now, the Opera House was built with its own self-generating gas system so that it could provide gas lights on the stage of the house itself. But that was at that moment all that the city had in terms of the use of what we would call manufactured gas. Well, as soon as people began to come at night to these lovely performances, many of the women began to complain because it was pitch dark. There was no way in the world they could see. People literally were walking to the Opera House carrying torches. And of course, at this point in time, a man by the name of W.W. Gibbs, assisted by another gentleman named C.F. Zeke, stepped forward and offered to provide a manufactured gas service, primarily to provide fuel for street lights. And the city council said yes. All they had to do was negotiate the proper price. And so beginning in 1886-87, we had our first street lights here. And that kind of fuel would be basically the fuel for lighting for quite a long time for many of the buildings, because even with the coming of the electric service, it was more expensive, and the public officials were very slow to operate on this. Now, at the same time, we have to remember that things were totally different for our cousins out in rural areas, on the farm. At this point in time, there was none of the utilities that we've just described. Instead, on the farm close to Pensacola, basically what you would see was what we called a windmill. And the windmill, of course, turned a belt mechanism, which in turn operated a pump, which brought water up out of the ground. And this was then piped right to the residence or the farm or the barn. And usually they had a secondary service there, which was a hand-operated pump. And this would, of course, be located inside, in some cases, inside at the kitchen sink. Many times it was outside, where people literally had to do all of their water pumping at that one place. And we must add at this point that the whole of the county was very, very fortunate in all of this, because it sat upon what was known as the sand and gravel aquifer, a beautiful flow of water coming basically out of the north, a water flow which people all over the United States would certainly did then and still today do envy, because it is a very powerful flow and a wonderful addition to the community. So basically we have our essential services in place by the year 1890-92, and that's where things stood when we came to the next step.